So we organised the event this evening at Belfield in Portobello as part of Community Land Week that's happening all across Scotland this week, and this was an event to celebrate what we've done here at Belfield Parish Church, where we've had the first urban community right to buy happen here, and we're really making use of these halls and this beautiful church building for the communities. But also a colleague of mine from Kenya was over, and so we were also hearing her story of the community land struggles in Kenya and really getting a sense of the realities of what people face in other parts of the world. Welcome to Belfield. Community property, it covers 6 billion hectares, which is over half of the world's surface. So we often think of community lands as being small, marginal, 3% of Scotland, a few percent here and there. It's more than half the world's land surface is community land, is managed by communities, governed by communities. Very often the state denies their right to manage and govern their lands, as we'll see in Kenya, and they're burnt off their lands, they're evicted, whatever else. But that's the state of most of the world's land, is it's governed by communities. So the two things we're focused on here are the way in which new laws are encouraging community lands, both here in Scotland, obviously, with the 2003 Land Reform Act, and then with the various acts since then. Community lands are something that's been growing and emerging, and that's why it's being celebrated this week across Scotland. So, yeah, there's huge resistance from elites who benefit from saying, you can't manage your land, we'll control it for you. You're incapable of doing it. So the question is, are we? Are we incapable of managing our own lands, our own resources, or can we do it?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Milka. As you've seen, I am from the Sengwer Community, and we are a forest indigenous community living in two forests in Kenya, in Kabolet Forest and Embobut Forest. You may not figure out the spellings now, but don't worry. So we also suffer the same kind of problems from elites who think that we can not take care of our land. And in the process of asking ourselves whether or not we are incapable, we are suffering a lot of evictions back home. At many points, we struggle to tell what it is that conserves our land, but it is exactly that. We don't conserve. It is our way of life that has conserved these lands and these forests for a long time. In sub-Saharan Africa, where Kenya falls in, is that we have 75% generally of lands being managed by communities. But unfortunately, this number of Africans are being evicted from their ancestral homes and their community lands for creation of national parks. And one thing that I would want to comment about the national parks is that, you know, with tourism and many of people from outside Africa wanting to visit Africa, all the states and the governments want to create more of these parks, you know, to get the money from tourists and whoever. But at the end of it, leading to a lot of sufferings to the communities that have been taking care of these lands and have been living with the livestock and the forests for ages. We have now the reasons as to why my community is being evicted from the forest, to create protected areas and forest reserves. But as we all know, and as science has proved, securing community land rights is the best way to conserve these forests and these parks and this livestock, because it is their way of life that conserves, and not laws, not guns, not guards.
I kind of want to say there's quite a strong connection between what happens here and what happens there. So I want to tell the story very briefly of what's happened here at Belfield in terms of saving these buildings, these grounds for the community, and then look at what we're trying to do in relation to the West Bank, the pits site. So just to give a couple of examples of what's been happening here. So the basic premise is we had a fast-growing population, we have vanishing community spaces, and that led to us mobilising to try and save these grounds and buildings for the community. And I mean, lots of churches are closing, and those have been really vital community spaces, including this one, where the halls have been, whether you went to church or not, the halls have been absolutely fundamental. The spaces for community, for community life, in that kind of very open way where nobody's making a profit out of you, have been kind of closing down in that way. So it's been really vital to keep some of it open. But we've been talking with the Church of Scotland since 2013, and this was partly to do with the ideas that the Reverend Andrew Patterson, who was the last minister in this church, had about this church becoming a kind of a centre for a sustainable society, a just transition, a place for thinking about justice and about the environment. And in particular, he was interested in John Muir. Now, as we know, John Muir was born in Dunbar. The John Muir Way goes right past here, along the Prom, out to the west, coast to coast. And John Muir was the great naturalist who had a great wonder for the natural world, but also started the first national park at Yellowstone in California, which was the first place where people were thrown off their land in the name of conservation. I find that really interesting that we have this person who has a very strong spiritual connectedness to nature, and from whom we get the John Muir Awards and all sorts of stuff that's really good. And he also carried that assumption that people have to be thrown off their lands, that somehow humans don't really belong. You can't have nature and humans, you've got to have one or the other. You know, you either exploit it to make lots of money, or you put a fence around it and keep people off. So that notion was very, very strong. Started with what he was doing in America, and then spread from there right across the world. So I think we've got a really interesting legacy to look at here. It runs right along the seafront, and I think he had a lot of really lovely ideas and thinking. Like most of us, he was complex, and he also started something that had really drastic impact. In 2016 we started the Friends of Belfield, and we had a cabaret here that raised a couple of £1,000. We got to 1,500 people signing. We then had to form ourselves into Action Porty, and we got 340 members in 4 days because we suddenly realised we needed to have membership. And we had Urban Animations, who were the kind of providing us with huge amounts of advice and support and ability to engage with us. We had good support from those in the civil service who were responsible for this stuff, really helpful at answering questions and so on. That winter, so 2017, we got granted the next stage of recognising our right to buy. So in March 2017 we had a community ballot which said the ballot papers went out to all of you. We received the keys on the 6th of September, when Dan Cunningham was here, and somebody from high up in the Church of Scotland was here. That was amazing. There's that saying about when you build roads, you get more traffic. Well, if you retain or create more community space, you enable more community. There isn't a limit. The more of that you create, the more you create that energy, that community energy, and that community ability to engage and to take more ownership and more responsibility. It's not finite. It's either dwindling or it's really growing in that way. And I would say it's really growing strongly here.
We've just heard a couple of accounts of community ownership, one from Kenya and one from here in sort of Portobello in Scotland, really. Both very different and very powerful stories, both talking about the power of communities to mobilise and what they can do when they are kind of focused, really. The Kenyan story in particular was completely inspirational in terms of what people are doing, the context within which people are doing that.
20 years ago, the community right to buy didn't exist, the Land Commission didn't exist, so there is supportive legislation. It's a quietly radical time, I like to think, at the moment in land reform in Scotland.
The sun goes up, the sun goes down, the stars come out and spin around. All in Portobello, in Portobello. All in Portobello, in Portobello. All in Portobello, in Portobello.